Okay. Happy New Year. Uh, this this kind of awkwardness that shows up for me every time when I'm sitting here and holding the space of, all right, this is beginning. There's always this delay where I have to guess when Facebook starts recording. It's very easy for a performance thing to boot up and go, let me take this part over. Um, Slowly loosening that, which is really good. So today I wanted to, there's a couple of things that feel alive for me, are merging together. Um, in Missed yesterday in part because after the conversation the day before yesterday for day 27 with Carissa, she and I followed up the next day because she had a sense that there was a piece that she has that she thought might be a very practical tool that I'd be missing. Um, uh, in terms of if someone were to write down the tool, it was something that I've known about for a very long time. I've tried to use a number of times. In fact, I've talked a lot about here. Um, I what I took from that was I think quite a bit different than was quite a bit different than what I'd had, what I imagined she had in mind. But in this particular area, I found it a little difficult to track what exactly she was thinking. Normally, I don't have that kind of challenge. I'm usually pretty quick at identifying how someone I'm interacting with is thinking and what the structure of. I might talk about this at some point when it's not as intellectual a thing, but I've long talked about mental architectures and the general tools that people use in their minds and how those tools interact. There's a kind of transparency for that for me. Um, and on this particular topic, I found it really tricky to follow some of her thinking, which is an unusual experience for me. But the main piece I pulled from that was a recognition of how readily, like I've known this for quite some time, but part of the game is, well, what is the knowing without the embodying? How quickly I abandon being with my body, with my bodily experiences. It's very quick for me to talk about, here I am describing my bodily experiences, and as I'm saying this, I'm actually vividly aware of the experience of my breath, my feet on the floor, my hands holding this cup. There's a vivid reality to it. It's very easy, like you can see it. This is like one of my great tricks for for reading mental architectures. If you watch my eyes, each time I'm going to do, like I go, and then I come in. There's a way where, like with pretty much everybody, when my eyes do that, except for that moment because I was demonstrating by the physical movement, but when my eyes do that, I'm not looking at what my eyes are pointed at. I'm not sure why eyes need to move off to the side like that. There's a bit of sort of want to call it lore. It's like a piece of received wisdom. I don't know whether it's true or not, or whether something like it is true, but from neurolinguistic programming, a systematized method of basically hypnosis. There's this idea that what corners somebody's eyes look in when they're going internal and doing some kind of processing can tell you what kind of internal experience they're having. So the classic mapping is that somebody who looks up and to the left is visually remembering something. Looking straight to the left is auditorily remembering something. So up and to the left might be remembering what the Christmas tree looked like, well, yesterday, also when I was 5. If I'm looking at, well, what did it look like? Did we have, were they all white lights or were they colored? As opposed to which room in the house I was growing up in made the loudest sound, sorry, the lowest pitch sound when the door was slammed. Right. So for me, I'm inclined to look over here. The classic lore in NLP is that many people will by default look off to their left to access that sound because it's a remembered sound as opposed to a manufactured sound. So they'll have a mapping like that. The part that I find most relevant is the way in which that act of looking, regardless of what direction someone is looking in, means that they're usually not experiencing what their eyes are pointed at, and therefore the lived experience of the present moment is not embodied. They're going into a kind of computation. I've come to think of this as being in the left hemisphere, in a thought bubble, when somebody's accessing a thought bubble instead of the present moment. That's not inherently bad. But there's a part of me that wants to judge it, particularly in myself when I'm doing it. There's a sense of when I come back and I go, wait, I didn't mean to get lost in thought. So even now, I'm now becoming really conscious because I'm sort of giving some of my keys of, oh, how do you read someone? Oh, I'm showing how to read me. Like basically every time I'm, it means that I'm actually losing touch with what's going on with my body. Less often when I look down, often I'm actually looking down at my body. And sometimes I look out in order to see what's out the window. It helps to give me a sense of expansiveness when I do that. But there's a quality in the eyes, I observe, that when someone's eyes sort of, right, there's that kind of glazed over look. Right there, what I did to do that is I started visualizing a sphere, and I'm looking at the angle of how are the east-west meridians, or meridians is not the right word, but like that flash, that like, oh wait, but that's not the right word. There's a quality to the eyes that is when engaged in the thought bubble. The same thing is going on when someone is looking up at something in the ceiling versus there's a slight quality shift in the eyes. It's visual. So I notice how when I'm actually paying attention to something like how my eyes are moving, what I'm doing with them. For example, if I focus on this, it doesn't work very well. I'm very often thinking about embodiment instead of being embodied. So what I mean by being embodied, here I'm feeling into it. There's this, like, what does it mean to feel my feet on the floor? That's not a question that a thought bubble can answer. I mean, it can come up with a description, but the description happens after accessing it. The actual sequence is when I feel my feet on the ground. That's real. And then while being in touch with that reality, I set my mind to articulating it. Oh, there's a way where I'm somehow with the experience. What is that withness? Almost like I have inner eyes, and my inner eyes are looking there. But it's more intimate than that. It's a contact. I'm actually touching, because that's what the touch is. But it's like the consciousness in this body, am touching the sensation of the feet. And that's what it means to be with, in some sense. I look at that and I go, well, like, as a mathematician, how are the definitions working? Is that everything I want to say? One of the ways that the self-titled rationality community would drive me a little bonkers, as when I'm trying to feel into, I think I'm sensing something like this, and I'm start trying to feel into reality and bring up an articulation. But if the articulation doesn't have the logical coherence needed to describe a model, there's readiness to like, hey, but this part's inconsistent. Like, uh, then the reason for the contraction is because, and I only am recognizing this now. I'm sort of like in the last year, but especially like it's getting more clear, as especially more clear lately. The problem being that I'm trying to connect my relationship of my mind with my physical experience, and the push is towards emphasizing consistency, which is a mental operation that the mind can, in some sense, do faster when it's not in contact with physical experience. Physical experience is slow. This is where the intuitions and energies of the body move. The sense of, is what I'm doing here relevant? Is this right? Does this matter? Those are things the body is much better at nailing down than the mind is. But the mind is faster than that. Like there's a dialogue that I find my body has to do with the world and with taking something in and pausing and breathing and going, does this feel right? And I have to wait. Whereas if I want to ask a question, do I think this is consistent with this particular model of economics? There's something I can do. There's no waiting. I can move my mind. If my mind has to wait on my body in order to have the information to be able to do its processing, the mind is waiting too. It's in an idle position. So the task of coming up with mental consistency of a model, there's an illusion that it can happen faster by disconnecting from bodily experience and just making things compute. I say it's an illusion. It's a little dismissive to call it just an illusion. There's actually something real going on there. The mental computations are actually faster when they aren't constantly dialoguing with the physical sensations. And like algebra can give you results you weren't expecting, the mind can give results that are relevant to the physical world that you wouldn't expect by default with the mind just staying in touch with sensation. That's part of the point of the mind. The problem I find, I find, this is also like Ian McGilchrist's main work about the left and right hemispheres of the brain, is noticing there's a big issue here on a global scale. When that part of the mind, when that function runs in a way that stops noticing that there's something to check in with, it can come up with models that make sense, that it will defend against information coming in, such as from reality, such as from physical sensation. It will defend against that input and ignore it and filter it out because it's not consistent with the model, and it will run with the model. That's the error mode I am really prone to. There's like a strong gravitational pull towards that. Even just talking about this, trying to articulate what it is that I am staring at, what I am struggling with here. Struggling is a strong word at this point. Hold it. I think holding is a better description. There's something gentler about it. I'm holding it, I'm wondering about it, but I'm being in touch with it. It's this propensity, this gravity towards escaping the body and going into these computational worlds and then defending against reality. That's basically the formula for how to summon death and horror. Not because of some sort of magical law that says that that's bad, but because if I live in a fantasy world that I am convinced is real, at some point reality comes knocking to the extent that that difference matters. And over time, it's more likely for that difference to matter and for reality to smack me harder and harder. These are malefic influences. The most extreme example is death. So it's all very mechanical when I look at it clearly. So seeing this and even having a mental model of how this makes sense, one of the big challenges for me has been, how do I keep my mind in dialogue with my body and focus predominantly on the truth that my body is in touch with? Is one of it's almost like that's the main function. I find that my body it's not just a tool for accomplishing tasks. That's the mind's way of viewing the body, but it's like this icon, sort of like I'm living in this computer world, and I have I have the body function where I can extend my hand and capture this cup and bring it to my lips in order to deal with the parameter of thirst. If you ever look at The Sims, this phenomenon made very explicit. There are no bodies in The Sims. There are icons that represent a collection of functions, including a time-space location. And you're supposed to deal with hunger and fun and um, uh, like restfulness and bladder, like these parameters. Like it's something like how I experience my mind orienting to my body. But in terms of the real world, what I actually experience when I pay attention to it is that my body is my relationship with truth. The mind is not responsible for truth. The mind is something like a computer. It says, given an input, what is the output, according to some sort of computational rules. My body is here. When I reach for the cup, I feel the cup. That's not a thought, that's a fact. Truth is here. So any attempt to do mental computations that are not grounded as much as possible in what my body is experiencing is fantasy. And that fantasy runs the risk of sealing off from truth and running away, and not knowing it has done so. So if I live in one of these thought bubbles, I don't even know it unless I tune into my body and I feel the discomfort that's happening in my body, because this is the instrument of truth. I could say the instrument of is, of being. So that makes sense to me, and I can feel the truth of that. Like my mind concludes that, and I hold that to my body, and my body rings with that. That's a lot of what I've been leaning towards in this entire series, this entire arc. This business of what does it mean to communicate? There's a part of me that is conscious of the fact that I'm going on a bunch of different tangents. I'm not actually striking at the core of either the title that I gave or the text for this video. And there's a little bit of, when I think that thought, there's a stirring that happens in my stomach. There's a bit of a worry. Am I meandering too much? But there's a level of trust that has to do with recognizing that communication is not about information passing between minds. That's a little bit like saying that email is about, like communication being about information passing between minds is roughly like describing the main purpose of email to be the transmission of words and digital structures from one computer to another. There's a way in which it's sort of technically correct, but it's the reason we have this description of technically correct, like this is hitting at it technically matters, but does it matter? Materially, does it matter? The level at which communication can transform is always at the level of truth, of being. The transmission of ideas only matters if it materializes in the matter, in the flesh. So this business of what is it that I am communicating? It's not a logical structure. The logical structure becomes a container for something that I experience as a kind of energy, or as a kind of holding, a vibration, a truth that is in my body, that the mind articulates to offer. If I focus on the logical structure of this is what I want to say, here's how I'm going to say it, that's how it comes forward. Not to say that that's irrelevant, but if that becomes the centerpiece, then the only way that I can give the impression of conveying something true is by inviting you into the same thought bubble that I built for myself, and invite you into your own version of that same thought bubble. So there's a mathematical isomorphism between them, so that when I say things and you compare them to the contents of your thought bubble, your mind can go, yep, that's consistent. But that doesn't necessarily change what the body is doing. It doesn't change what the body experiences. It can, because if you focus on a thought bubble, like there's this experience that I have of when I focus on the contents of a thought bubble. Like I think, wait, I, my partner is currently traveling and meeting up with people, and there's this like, what is she? What's her experience like? And there's a way where I can tell myself a story that would have me feel worry and anxiety, but that feeling is coming up from the body, and I interpret that feeling in the context of I am worried about, like, is she okay? Is like what are the kinds of experiences that she is having? Is she there are parts of me that that worry about like jealousy stuff. Like, is she meeting people that I'm going to have to compete with? Like those kinds of thoughts can stir energies in the body. That changes the body's experience. But then I interpret those experiences in the context of the thought bubble. I'm experiencing this within this thought bubble. Oh, I'm feeling anxiety and discomfort. That's because I'm really scared about the possibility of her being at risk or her meeting somebody or whatever. But I don't think that's true. I think what's actually going on is the anxiety has to do with me living in this fantasy world that isn't true. It's not that the content of the claims can't match reality. That's a different topic entirely. It's that this thought bubble is out of touch with the lived experience of my body. The lived experience that my body has of my partner. The grounding in now and here. How I relate to it. What is this thought even for? Does it matter? Does it materialize? So, I say all this in this sort of arcing, a little bit rambly, because I've noticed a kind of aliveness showing up for me about, well, why do I abandon my body? Why do I go into these thought bubbles? This is my main defense tactic. My main way of dealing with sensations in me that I don't care for. My main way of trying to make my world better. The big one for me, I'm just now realizing I don't think in this entire video series have I ever mentioned the term the flickering hell. If you're watching this at this point and you saw the conversation between me and Carissa 2 days ago, the flickering hell is the name that I had been giving that experience of the vast all of everything where each moment is eternal. And these tiny flickers outside of time would have me then experiencing another version of reality for eternity and feeling like I don't have control over how this flickering works, so that I would experience infinite bliss and then infinite horror and then infinite nothingness and then just being dead forever, and just like being in all of these different conditions, but each moment I experience as an eternity of everything that is, being entirely that experience. This is by huge leaps and bounds the most horrific experience I have ever gone through. It's something that I have encountered a number of times, mostly through the use of ayahuasca and then more recently bufo, but occasionally just from meditating. just seeing all of this vastness and going, I recently realized that this is how the fear of death appears for me. So part of the horror of it is the recognition that that is actually true in a very deep and important way, and it is obvious the way in which I will need to face it at the moment of death. Not as an idea. It's like I don't need a double-blind clinically controlled trial to determine that I am breathing right now. I don't need a scientific theory to tell me that I am breathing right now. I just know it. I can feel it. I'm here with it. It's on that level of knowing that I can see, oh, that's how that part of death and consciousness interact. So not so much bodily fear of death, but consciousness fear of the experience that comes afterwards. That clicked in part during my conversation with Carissa 2 days ago. The went on too many tangents and I'm a little lost. What was I focusing on? Let me just bring it back to where I wanted to go in the first place. So this thing of, why am I running from my body? I don't want to ask that question as an intellectual pursuit to boot up a thought bubble that produces a self-model, is that's enacting the very thing that I'm trying to ask myself about. It's also not important that I know why. I would like to have a self-model and a thought bubble that is anchored in truth. I want that. But it's less important that that happens than that my mind orients towards anchoring in truth. This is something I've been focusing on for quite some time, especially strongly over the last couple of months. And I notice I encounter in practice resistance to doing so. Not like, oh, this is a bad idea, although there are parts of me that are scared of it. There's things like, am I going to have to face the flickering hell? Is it actually that everything is horrible at a meta level constantly, and that it's entirely and purely being ignorant of that that allows for this experience of some kind of continuity and an enjoyment of being in this world, because this world doesn't exist? That's more than a theory. It's something I've encountered a couple of times as something like a vivid possibility. So there's fear about, what if the truth is deeply horrible, and recognizing it is has me constantly experiencing that horror in a conscious way. Sort of a Lovecraftian view of reality. There's a lot of fear there. That's the way that my fear of death appears. My fear of, what if the truth is bad? Without finishing the thought that goes the rest of the way of, well, the same principle that I see so clearly about you can't defy the truth forever means that at some point I'm definitely going to encounter this. So even if it's horrible, it still makes sense to orient to it, because it's already here. I logically know that. This is a place where the thought bubble algebra is ahead of the body, or ahead of the mind-body loop, I should say. It's ahead of there's a bubble that is isolated from the mind-body loop that is able to conclude some things that I can tell are correct. But connecting that to the way that the fear activates in the body is a trick. So just being with, even in the course of this video, this live stream here, noticing how rapidly I lose track of the sensations of my body, and whether what I'm saying is true, and whether it matters. It's a trick. It's difficult. What's the difficulty? What's fighting back? To answer that by looking, the same way I can look at the experience of my feet, the way that I can feel my breath. What is that inclination? How do I dissolve it? In practice, not as a theory, in practice. How? I find that the act of asking that question and holding it makes something very lived. Settle. Creates a kind of breathing room. So entitled this about embodying shamelessness. Part of the reason for that is feeling into what did I want to talk about today. Embodiment, this thing about embodiment, um, making thoughts matter. I keep using this in case, so in case you're at this point and you didn't read the blurb of like what is this concept, what's this word matter. There's this bit of etymology about how our words matter and materialize all come from the same root as the word maternal. It's the Latin root mater for mother. The flip side of that is paternal, which is pattern. So the fusion of matter and pattern produces the next, like manifestation. There's like a manifestation game that happens here. So there's a mythic thing that feels very a helpful frame that my mind can offer that helps to ground some of these questions and some of this way of orienting. Notice I'm getting a little distracted because I see a comment. I want to take a look at this. Hey, Rupert. Rupert says, I don't understand the question, what if reality is a horror? Are you suggesting that perhaps our understanding of how reality is fundamentally mistaken? I am talking about I'm trying to articulate the nature of a fear that boots up in me very readily, that causes me to cringe. This is not analytic. It's not the result of analysis. It's the result of an encounter. That said, that encounter I can make sense in terms of analytic. What is the ontology? What is the structure of reality such that that could make sense? So when I translate the experience of the fear into a, oh my God, maybe this is what is true, the truth that comes forward, the potential idea of what could be true comes forward as, yeah. I mean, so first I think it seems worth saying that of course our understanding of how reality is fundamentally mistaken. Like it seems really obvious that that's got to be true. There's this shows up in things like the way that like you and I have talked about this before. Like where does the math come from? We can show that the math is internally consistent, but who is showing it? Who's being shown? How do we know that the math is even there? Why do we find those questions suspiciously uninteresting to really explore and look at? And so there are gaping holes in the foundation that we just assume, well, obviously reality is objectively there, and there are these mathematical laws that somehow, by some mechanism, we don't even pretend to understand, but we'll ignore the fact that we don't even pretend to understand it. There's some weird mechanism by which these mathematical equations that describe some sort of interaction of math with math somehow shapes the physical world, so that we have the law of gravity, which is an equation that's describing something about a force. What's the link between the math and the actual lived experience? Unclear. But we'll not ask that question too deeply because we can do experiments, which is a matter of translating our experiences into a mathematical form, and then noticing that that mathematics matches our models. And that's consistent with this magic of how math is somehow the physical world. Like somehow quantum mechanics describes the physical world as literally being wiggling math. Light is the waveform going on between changing electrical and magnetic fields. So there are waves in the electromagnetic field. But what is that? It is not something that exists outside of the mathematics. It is instead defined by it being a kind of math that somehow affects electric charges. What's that somehow? Well, it just does. We do the experiments. It turns out it works. So there's all these gaping holes in I'm picking on the science paradigm because it's the one with the most authority and the most assumption of correctness. So I'm going to pick on that one because none of our paradigms are actually um, like they can't be complete. That was one of the points of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, right? That's like recognizing that any paradigm that is complicated enough to literally count has in it either um, true statements that you can't prove or false statements that you can. It's like you're guaranteed one or the other. And so there's this way where all of these thought bubbles that we create, that we try to say maybe this thought bubble correctly describes reality, all of them are wrong or incomplete. They're all incomplete in really critical ways that matter. So that to me, and everything I just described, you can describe within a thought bubble. So like maybe there's some sort of meta thought bubble where this kind of works, but it would have to be beyond the reach of math, which would be a curious thing to explore, try to make sense of. So in that sense, it seems to me obviously our understanding of reality is fundamentally mistaken to the extent that we believe any of these thought bubbles. And we say, I have a theory of how things work, and that theory is correct. No, it's not. No theory is correct. It isn't possible. But that said, I'm the fear that arises in me that I'm trying to share, which I don't. This is not like I'm deeply afraid that this is actually true. Like it's clearly a traumatic response in me. That's part of. It's one of the pieces I'm grappling with. This traumatic response in me. When this arises, the sense is something like metaphorically. Like to grab theological language, just because I think it's clearer said this way. Maybe God is infinitely good, and also infinitely evil, and sadistic, and totally indifferent, and doesn't exist at all, and permeates all things. There's like having encountered some very vast experiences that encapsulate a tremendous range of things. It seems to me that consistency is a very small pocket of reality. Part of the whole game of being incarnated, of existing in this world, is living in the illusion of a consistency bubble. That's part of what time is made of, is this ignoring large chunks of reality. I say that from the place of like what matters, what's material, how are we here? What is time? This is not about a thought bubble. This is like just looking at it. It's right here. There's a vividness to how is this even here? How is this experience here at all? So the fear is that if I embody an understanding of the things that I have now come to cognitively understand a little bit better about, for instance, the nature of time, how it is that experience happens at all. There's a fear of something like losing my ability to experience time, to experience the illusion of time. It's related to the fear of going psychotic, but it's actually the opposite of psychosis. It's something like, it's the fear that going the opposite of psychotic far enough results in recognizing the fact that I am trapped forever in this eternal flickering isness that is infinitely blissful and infinitely horrible all at once, and nothing whatsoever and everything all at once. Like there's this thing of maybe I would rather be deluded. So that's the fear that arises in me. And Rupert says, you're reminding me of the first time I took a full hit of LSD. Yeah. I think psychedelics can do a really, not, I often don't, but they definitely can do a thing of breaking down the ability to live in any thought bubble. Sort of taking all the different thought bubbles that we're used to inhabiting and breaking them open and sort of smashing the content together against the experience of the body. this is just one frame of talking about it. When that happens, um, like sometimes when I've experienced this, the thing of the way in which the body is in touch with truth, it becomes clearer the way in which that too is like a mental projection, and the thing that I actually get in touch with is infinitely more vast than that, and there's a clarity to my body isn't really here. Nothing is here. I think that's after re-entering time, we'll ignore the terrible nonsensicalness of the grammar of that. One of the projects that's sort of hovering in the back of my mind is I think there's a way to fix grammar so that it is possible to allow for a way of talking about these things that doesn't build in the inconsistency into the attempt to talk about it. Because while the isness, while the vast isness has this unbounded paradoxical nature, because it's everything, the encounters with it, particularly after re-entering consistency pockets and sort of re-editing, well, what was that experience and how do I orient to it? There's totally a way of talking about those experiences in a way that holds their vastness without having to do these linguistic somersaults that say things like, well, I left time, and then after a while, I noticed that I could see myself, and then I started remembering things, and then I re-entered time. Like, what does that even mean? But it turns out it means something. There's actually something to it. I just think the grammar is hard to do right. So I'm noticing getting a little into the weeds, which is to me an experience of like going off into some of these mental models. Right, so that's the move that I'm trying to trace. What is the thing there? What is the lived experience that has me? And I feel like I'm answering it by asking the question and noticing, and there it is, and there it is, and there it is. I haven't touched on shamelessness or how this is bridging to the whole thing about matter being rooted and material being rooted in maternal. I see David Swedlow has popped in saying, I responded about evil, quote unquote evil, in the Carissa stream. My working definition of evil is a bargain made by trading the illusion of certainty for the uncertainty of isness. Yeah. Yeah, that seems like a pretty good working definition. I notice my mind wants to throw a mild hissy fit, and my gut goes, yep. My mind throwing a hissy fit has to do with the sense that that doesn't answer something. But I think the fuel behind that energy is more the fear that I was talking about before. I don't know how early you popped on, David. I was referring earlier to that experience that Chris and I were talking about in that conversation towards the end, where I was referencing the vast isness, sort of the mind of God, loosely speaking, and the way in which that feels like everything, and how can that have benevolence? I mean, of course it has benevolence. It also has malevolence. It has all of the things. For a long time, I'd been talking about that in my own lived experience as the flickering hell. So I was referring to some of that earlier, and there's this question that will pop up, particularly when I'm on the verge of stepping outside of time, which is something like, isn't ignorance better? Like, if it's really meta-horrible, if truth is meta-horrible, and evil and ignorance are the same thing, then maybe being evil is actually just better. Maybe the whole point is recognizing it's actually great to be evil. Like that's, and there's some sort of feeling like this. There's a logic piece that's missing or something. But I can feel the way that this is stirring things in me. I'm working with it. Frankly, I like your definition. So, I enjoy the way that this kind of thing scrambles the mind and sort of requires my mind to work within the unknowing, the not knowing. This is grounding in the feeling of my body in this moment, feel into what makes sense here. So this the thing that I feel myself wrestling with, wrestling, holding. I alternate between holding and wrestling, really. How deeply do I want to choose truth, and where does the choice come from? We're recognizing truth is not an abstraction. It's not in a thought bubble. It's here. And said differently, what is it that pulls me out? So the reason I mentioned about embodying shamelessness, this became an iteration of this showed up for me earlier this morning, talking with some friends, noticing the way that one of them was talking about some of her more challenging experiences with her mother, who stayed with her over Christmas. A lot of the things that she talked about, I noticed that there's a particular sort of pattern in how she was orienting to the whole thing, that I could identify as, oh, right here you're doing a move that in my mind is tagged as giving your power away. Like you're not allowing your mother to just decide that you are being bad, or that you're being a bad person, or you're unwilling to let your mother believe that you are being unreasonable or even being manipulative. And so the holding that is what's giving her your power, because you're doing this kind of thing here. And also the energy of, oh, I can feel the victim flavor of, yeah, this happened, and like my mother does this, and then I can't stand that, and I'm struggling with this. And so I could identify all these patterns. But there was in me a hesitation. And this feels like a wise hesitation. It showed up in terms of wanting to share what I was seeing. Because the place in me that was coming from is, oh, you're doing these things, and you should be doing it this other way instead. It's the whole rescuer pattern in me. The whole way that I'm seeing and projecting onto others, oh, you're messing up your life in these ways, and I can help you. I'm not noticing that that's what I'm doing, but feeling it. Feeling that there's something off because basically because I'm not in my body. I'm not really paying attention to the energies. The energies have an opportunity to arise in me, activate my thoughts, and then the thoughts stimulate an impulse to speak. If it's getting as far as activating the thoughts, and I'm believing the thoughts, I'm not in my body. I'm not noticing the energies at all. Well, at all, but I'm not noticing them. Part of where I ended up working through that was just reorienting back to, wait. My work is mine, her work is hers. Like, and this is a thought, but there's a grounding thing of like living in the body, living in my body, and just sort of letting go, trusting she's doing her process. She's doing her own spiritual truth evolution in exactly the way that she needs to, because if there were some other way, truth would be holding her differently. That's what truth is. It's reality. You can't get away from reality. No one can. So holding on to, well, not even in terms of helping her, but in terms of recognizing, am I even seeing what help is? Am I seeing what needs to happen? Does need to happen even make sense as a framework here? The mind is not in a position to answer those questions, but I can feel in my body what is true, because that's what the body is. It's the instrument of being here. But that's something I feel, I can know, as opposed to just thinking it as a thought bubble. So in that, I noticed that it was actually a lot easier for me. Like I ended up referencing how I talked about this, and I shared this with her, saying, I noticed that there are these things that I feel tempted to point out, but I'm coming from a place of, in some sense, trying to disrespect you, disrespect what you're going through. And so what that brings me to is, what's going on in me? Why is that happening in me? What do I need to be with? What needs the digestion? And noticing in myself how, um, and it'll pop out of the as I'm speaking to her, but I ended up sharing with her, oh, I recognize something in her story that is where I would get hooked, and how I would try to use my mind in order to do this emotional post-processing, in order to, like, I would feel the hook from the other person doing the kind of manipulative tactics that she was describing from her mother. And I would feel hooked, and then I would have to do these mental moves in order to cut the hooks. But the hookability would still be there. It would be after the energies arose. How do I stop the interaction from fueling the manipulative pattern? Which is better than completely ignoring it, I guess. But recognizing in myself, oh, this is about where I get hooked and where I feel I shouldn't be hookable, and trying to fix the instances I'm projecting on my friend. There's feeling into that and recognizing I could even make a move. This is a piece I picked up from Perry Chase, I was really grateful for. Recognizing that I could choose to feel ashamed about the fact that I was doing all of that. But the shame would also be sort of rolling around in a kind of pain that would distract me from being in touch with the truth of my body, and my mind reconfiguring in touch with that reality of what I had been doing just there. And in the course of doing that, I could actually feel my hookability dissolving, being willing to go, oh yeah, I was doing this with you. I was judging what you were doing and thinking that I know better. And that's there. And in that feeling, how even just dissolving that much, how suddenly, if I had been in the situation that her mother was in, I could feel the space where I wouldn't have to do this emotional post-processing. I could actually go, oh, yeah, maybe I am being really manipulative and unfair to you. But that's not my perspective, and I'm not going to buy into it. So if that's true of me, then I guess I just get to be an awful person. And you get to recognize that and condemn me for it. That's what's true here. If that's your experience, then that's how you're going to run with it, because I don't agree with you, and this is where I'm going to stand. So feeling that kind of clarity, this embodying shamelessness, like I cannot be shamed if I am willing to fully experience in my body all of that. If I'm willing to fully materialize, fully be in the matter of Mother Earth, this being the dirt, this being the clay, the atoms and the physicality of the world, that I am the same way that this is my new body. My old body is my birth mother. Like my birth mother fashioned this to grow into this being. And her body before her current body was her mother's body. There's a materiality, which takes on the double meaning of it, of what does it even mean to have a body? What does it mean to materialize? It means that this is the flesh of Gaia. This is the flesh of Mother Earth. This is the flesh of the physical world, of the material world. Being willing to fully incarnate, to fully materialize, and be with this, not as an abstraction. Like these are some neat thought bubbles to give some framing, but the framing creates a lived change that I experience between what it means for me to be here. In doing that, I become without shame, without guilt. I might do things that harm what I care about, but I become unshameable, shameless. There's something about that I observed, just in sharing that with my friend. I got the impression, I don't know, but I got the impression that me living that embodiment communicated at a material level, at a physical, somatic, body-to-body kind of level, a different way for her to embody a relationship to the energies that she was holding about her mother, her own hook ability. Like, I saw her relax. That was much more obvious. And the whole thing felt very clean, very easy. Like it wasn't important for me to get a certain response from her. I could just totally let go of that because she's doing her life. So all of this feels like things that that are exactly on the topics that I've been talking about before. The content doesn't actually feel new to me. In terms of when I listen to the words and I look at the ideas, what content am I offering that's different? All I've got is the etymology thing. I don't think I mentioned the etymology before, but that's in the thought bubble. The entire point is I can feel a deepening of something. The actual lived embodiment of the lesson of being here, being willing to be with that which dies. That doesn't resolve the flickering hell intellectually. But it gives me a kind of a way of orienting to the fear that the truth might be horrible, without dismissing the fact that that's the way the fear gets articulated when it reaches the mind. Looks like there's a little more here. Rupert says, can I understand these experiences you're talking about just through meditation practice or whatever and without psychedelics? This can all come from paying attention to isness. I mean, yes. Like I have a little uncertainty in that I took a path that mixed meditation and psychedelics. And things that are sort of halfway between, like breath work, like basically doing a meditative shamanic hyperventilation. But also, most of the grounding that I get in doing any of these things actually comes from very mundane practices. What does it feel like for me to be washing the dishes? Why am I exercising when I exercise? What in me is moving that? This is where almost all of the practice is. It feels like even from getting the most profound psychedelic insights, those insights are sort of, okay, I once gave a tweet saying basically that psychedelics show you where you're going, but not how to get there. Meditation shows you how to get there, but not where you're going. I'm actually really grateful that I combine these two so that I neither get lost in, oh, we can just save the world by getting everybody to smoke bufo. That might be true, but there's this question of when you've had a psychedelic experience, how do you integrate it? How do you take the insights and bring it into your life? There's these challenges of people like the people around Timothy Leary. This to me is like one of the biggest one of the biggest real warnings that I encounter. Like there's stuff about, oh, you might go crazy if you have tendencies towards schizophrenia, maybe it can trigger the schizophrenia, blah, blah, blah. I think a lot of that is propaganda. I don't know how real those risks are in a meaningful way. I've seen some people go psychotic, but I don't think it was because of psychedelics. I've seen people go psychotic from going to a workshop and being prone towards psychosis. So, but the story of Timothy Leary and his friends, just being amazed at how clear the vision of compassion and reality and isness is through LSD. And this is all about, hey, let's have this psychedelic revolution. Let's save the world. We're going to have a consciousness revolution, a love revolution. Let's do this. Okay? And they were living together, and part of the context in which they were living together, like their group ended up falling apart. They weren't able to hold together close friendships in a way that would allow them to run a house. Excuse me. And the reason came down to they couldn't sort out how to deal with the kitchen. They couldn't sort out how to clean the dishes. Who was going to clean the dishes? How is the kitchen going to be functional? This is just one example, but it's an important one because it's material. Integration is kind of a funny way of talking about it. I think embodiment, it's like how do you embody the insights? I think from what I've been able to tell, the embodiment and the ability to embody the insights is actually more important than the insights, because that's what builds the bridge. That's what, like, you can have all of these fantastic spiritual teachings and be told you like meditate and have some kind of physical discipline where you're anchoring these things in your body and so on. That's great, but the key is, can you get these insights to be something that is lived in your life, rather than just being ideas in a thought bubble that you use in order to punish yourself for not for comparing your thought bubble of you to your thought bubble of how you should be, and then looking at the two, noticing the difference, and using that as a driver of pain to in your body. Like that's sort of the standard model. That's how most people seem to drive themselves. So getting to a place where you can hear spiritual ideas and go, well, instead of keeping it in this thought bubble, how do I bring it into the flesh? Not as a question for another thought bubble, but as an enacted question. The same way I'm asking the question, why do I abandon my body? What has me abandoning my body? I will eventually have a way to say this in a thought bubble form. I have models for this. Things having to do with the body is that which dies. There's fear about that. I can say things about that. I can say a lot about it. But it's less important that I can say it than that what I say is grounded in what matters, in what is matter. So, so I say all that. My impression is that there's this thing in Buddhism saying, take no intoxicating substances. I think that was established in Mahayana Buddhism specifically. Part of the reason for that is that there can be a distraction that comes along the lines of Timothy Leary's group. There's this distraction that LSD could save them all. But it can't, because if you can't integrate the results of the insights you get, then it doesn't matter how true your insights are. It doesn't matter until it materializes. This is not just wordplay. This is a literal description of the process. There's a need to bring it into the carnal. So meditation, there's a challenge with meditation in that most meditative practices emphasize a whole lot of at the body, I want to say. Like you sit down and yeah, you might have a lot of pains that show up, but just be with the pain and observe the pain. And it's like, okay, there's almost an emotional and somatic relationship to what the observing of the pain is. That is part of the learning process. And if you just do this for 20 to 40 years, then you might figure it out. It's the might part that's an issue, but you might figure it out, having to do with, can you be with the pain in an intimate way as opposed to staring at it from a distance? Like that's avoiding incarnation. That's avoiding mattering. So a lot of meditation is building this pathway of being here, getting out of these thought bubbles and into the flesh. Not as an idea, but as an actual doing. But if you don't know why you're doing it and you don't have a lived experience of what this resolves, then you can end up spending a very long time doing it to fit a model of how you should be, and focusing on the model, even implicitly in the background, and running this shame engine that is actually pulling you out of the body. So you end up getting very good at making your mind concentrate at your body, at your sensations. Which is, it's better than the default, a little bit. Okay? So there are lots of pitfalls that I see in the practice of how do you meditate in ways that are actually good and powerful, that will actually move you towards these things. There are real questions there. And I think that for many people, meditation actually isn't the path for them. In part because the way their minds are set up won't allow them to sit down and do the move that creates opening, that creates materialization. But I think for the most part, the same way, oh, maybe we can save the world by having everybody smoke bufo, I think, or take LSD or something like that, I think maybe there's a pathway of maybe we could save the world by having everybody meditate. It's a similar error, but the error has a grain of truth to it. I think that most people would be better off if they were to meditate. So, and where I was originally going, the thought that originally popped to mind in looking at this is, so with Buddhism, there's this thing about don't take intoxicating substances. The reason is that they want you to develop clarity in your orientation to these deeper experiences and insights, and to see how you got there, so that it's yours. So yeah, there's like all of Buddhism in an important sense is built on the fact that it is possible to get all of these insights purely through meditation and without any type of mentally altering substances. Yeah. The question of for whom is that true, and how do you do it? That's tricky. It is actually meaningfully tricky. Buddhism claims to give a lot of instructions, but what makes an instruction propagate is whether it is good at propagating. One way for it to do that is to be a useful instruction. Another way is to be really good at creating monasteries where people think that the instructions are good and end up repeating them. The fact that both of those are viable strategies for an instruction to have passed along over the course of centuries, like that alone gives me some sort of sense of, I don't know, how much do I want to trust what the Buddhism teachings are, what they have to say? But there's also the fact that a lot of, like, there's something kind of weird about having to, it taking 20 years, like in the ballpark of 20 years in most Zen traditions to become enlightened. 20 years is a short amount of time relative to the universe, even, but we're not talking about the universe, we're talking about individual human beings becoming enlightened. 20 years is a long time. And it's a particularly long time to not know why you should care about the goal. But still be doing the practices anyway. So there are challenges in that space. But the short answer is yes, I think that it's quite possible to understand those experiences. I see you also mention saying history of psychosis shortly after a period of psychedelic use here. Cool. Yeah, I know there are instances. What I don't have is something like the epidemiology. And it reminds me a little bit of how everybody was wringing their hands for when I was a kid around how marijuana is a gateway drug, and you can get hooked on it for life, and it can destroy your life, and melts your brain permanently, and like all of these fears floating around. It turned out that there is a grain of truth in some of it, but the reason for most of those ideas was because of intentional propaganda spread from the original reason why marijuana was made illegal, which primarily had to do with giving the government the power to be able to arrest Mexicans and to interfere with Latino culture in the United States. There's some really quirky history about this. The big three, the big three being marijuana, LSD, and heroin, was in order to attack Latino cultures, Black cultures, and the hippie movement. That's why they were made illegal. There's very little question about that anymore. It's funny that there's very little question, but we're still looking at it going, should we make drugs legal? But they're terrible. And what about like all this trouble with psychosis and so on? Well, that was from propaganda wars. But that isn't to say that there aren't. That isn't to dismiss the reality of it, of people having these experiences. it's not to dismiss there being a real threat. It's to highlight that the uh, the reason for the belief in the threat is propaganda. Someone is benefiting from it, which means it's worthwhile to pause and step back and ask, well, wait, but what's true then? The truth might happen to be the same as the propaganda, but truth isn't the reason this is being said. If truth isn't the reason something is being said, it's worthwhile to step back and ask, what do I actually know here? Not intellectually, although it's an important part of it, but what's true? What's real? What matters? Okay, Rupert says, are you saying that an enlightenment experience will help me be more effective at saving the world, or make me realize that my current framework of I have to be effective at saving the world is flawed? I wasn't actually trying to say either of those, but I do have something to say about it, which is both. It's let me feel into what is the truest way for me to say what I actually hold here. The idea that the world needs saving is one of these thought bubbles. And just like I was saying in terms of propaganda, there might be some truth to it, but that isn't the reason for the pieces being said or they're being thought. This is a meme. It's a demon. It is a thing that can activate people by giving them an opportunity to have some kind of meaning, but also to be really scared and to come up with arguments internally as well as externally as to why it is necessary to pressure other people to live their lives differently. Now, that isn't to say that there's no need to shape the world differently in order to encourage flourishing for all beings. And that's certainly not to say that this doesn't require some kind of behavior change in order to create a better world. But the reason for each of these things being pushed has to do with the need for this meme. Like the meme has a need itself. It's like as though the meme were conscious. The same kind of way we could think of the coronavirus being conscious. It's not a good material model of how the coronavirus works, but it still gives an intuition with things like, well, how did this mutation appear? Well, the mutation appeared because the coronavirus sort of wants to spread and keep surviving, and this mutation gives it a better shot. This is a terrible way of describing the actual quote-unquote reasoning at the biological level, but it pumps intuition in a useful way. In the same way, this meme wants to propagate and continue, and the best ways that it can do that, or there are lots of ways that it can do that, but the reason, anytime that there's a piece of truth that can ring with somebody, like, hey, you know, if we were to clean up the atmosphere, the air would be cleaner, that would be good. Look at these pictures of Los Angeles and the kind of smog that's in the valley there. Look at this giant island of trash in the Pacific Ocean. These are facts. And you can feel something in your body about the wrongness of these facts. Like, this is not a healthy environment for a body to be in. So it is true that there would be a kind of ease on the level of those facts if we could somehow clean all of this up. Okay, that's true. Then attached to this are all of these narratives about the reason for all of these things is because of this economic machine, and the economic machine is coming from these villains, basically psychopaths who have climbed to the top of the corporate ladder. Or maybe it's not primarily because of villains. Maybe it's just a cultural glitch, a general lack of awakening that has allowed some people who are cold-hearted up to the top. Or maybe it's not even people up at the top that are responsible. But there's still something happening that we need to do something about in order to make it so that we stop having this linear economy that dumps plastic trash into our landfills with this callous attitude of just throwing things into the garbage. without recognizing that there is no away. So when you throw something away, it goes somewhere. But we ignore that as a culture. Why? Well, because there's this numbness. We need to educate people. Right? This is one example of an arc. I know that your and my common background isn't primarily about environmentalism, mostly concerned about things with artificial intelligence. But the structure is the same. The emotional structure is the same. There's a truth, and then that truth gets folded into a narrative that is in one of these thought bubbles, where the intention is to make it so that when anybody who encounters this meme tries to point their mind at the truth and see reality clearly, the thought bubble has things to say and can pull attention back into the thought bubble so that that thought structure can continue to propagate and maintain itself. So yeah, there are truths inside these things. There needs to be. It wouldn't be as effective at deceiving its hosts if it didn't. But the reason for thinking the thoughts that we do when we're infected by these kinds of memes is to propagate them, not to see reality truly. You're asking effective altruism equals a bunch of thought bubbles. For the most part, yeah. I don't think it has to be, but in practice, what I've seen is predominantly how do we move everything about how we see the world into thought bubbles and then run a computation, rather than flipping the order and checking what's true. And I know that there's an effort. I want to honor the fact that a lot of people are sincerely trying their best, but they're not addressing this basic question of where is the drive to save coming from. They'll do thought bubble philosophy on that question, but they're not looking in the body to feel what energy is driving them, for the most part. And again, my descriptions may be out of date. I haven't been much in touch with that culture for a number of years. And I'm making sweeping generalizations based on my impression of the culture from this memory. But there are definitely going to be exceptions. But for the most part, that is my impression. So when it comes to the question of how do we actually create a good world, we have to be in touch with it. And so the only way I see for us collectively to get in touch with it is for us each to decide that that is what we want to do. And that decision is not a collective decision, it's an individual one. That individual one synergizes with others. But it has to be made at the individual level. So in this interaction, for instance, it can't work. If I pressure you into, no, you really need to get into your body. Right? If I add that bit of extra energy, look, you need to do this. If you don't do this, your life will be fucked up. You're contributing to the problem. Can you notice? Like I notice in my body, even just saying that, there's this. I'm modeling what it would be like for me to receive that kind of energy. There's this cringe. There's a contraction. In myself, that actually encourages the mechanism of me leaving my body and going into my mind. It becomes harder to be with my body sensations when I do that. So if I'm interacting with somebody who's trying to do that to me, they're hooking me in places that I haven't addressed the hooks, and then I'm abandoning my body in order to process or something. But the processing isn't addressing the fact that they could bug me in the first place, because I'm not staying in my body. I'm not staying with where the hooks are. So because of that, that means that even though I can see how I'm right, I'm seeing how I'm right from a wide perspective, and it needs to come with a lot of humility about something like, well, I can see in this thought bubble of how the world works and how this materialization works, why that pathway would result in a good world. But for that to work, I have to trust that others are doing themselves well, the best that they can, which is obviously the only thing anybody can do, and focus on me, not just because I'm supposed to, but because I can feel how that is the only thing I have control over. When I do that, and then I show up with somebody else, I can show the lived example at the somatic level, at the level that matters, what a lived version of this alternative way of being is. The more deeply I can do that, the more clear the transmission can be. Then others can see, I mean, this is me working in the thought bubble here. So in my thoughts, I can see how that would result in others having a more ready ability to recognize what I think is the true fact that they want to do this too. They might just not notice it. And by doing it in a way that is, instead of you need to do this, it is instead saying honestly, without trying to get people to do it, but instead just being myself and trusting that others are doing something sensible. I'm looking at me going, this is my work. Here is what I have found. I'm willing to share it with you in case you decide for yourself that this is relevant for you. And if you decide it's not, cool. Like, not like, cool, I'll accept it. It's like, okay, I don't know you. Like, I don't know your full depths. I don't know what it's like to be you. I am not you to the extent that it is possible for me to not be any given thing. So I can trust. All right. Cool. But that doesn't diminish the truth of what I'm experiencing for me. By coming with that kind of attitude, there's no pressure, and it's very easy to feel the true fact that I'm offering, I'm not pushing. And so you can know in yourself if you decide, oh, when I take this, I'm taking it for myself because I can feel for myself the truth of it, rather than because I'm trying to navigate some kind of weird social pressure here. That propagated throughout the world, that can result in a kind of materialization that can matter, that can clean up the oceans and can deal with AI risk and can do all of these different things, because we're not trying to solve these problems by manipulating each other anymore. Instead, we're doing it by seeing and feeling what's true and being with that, and then communicating from that basis of respect. And so, and then you're asking, Rupert, how do I know whether I'm not in touch with the world right now? And if so, in what ways? Yeah. So, I'm holding a very clear answer to that question. I'm wanting to emphasize that this is exactly the question that I was highlighting before. Like, the way that I receive that question is exactly the same one I was asking before. Why do I abandon my body? I know it sounds very, very different, but in terms of what the answer is to that question, causes that question to actually be isomorphic to the one I was asking earlier. I say that because it's very easy to take this and say, well, let's enter this thought bubble of how this works, which is a lot of what I was doing in terms of looking at the global scale, because I'm not living the global scale. I have to use these thought bubbles in order to extend my senses out into the world. Which is part of why it's so important to root them back in the earth, so that they're extensions of my senses rather than something I am pretending is its own separate sense. But I know I can feel my hands touching. I could ask myself, how do I know I am feeling my hands touching? And then I could create a thought bubble. And then go into the thought bubble and examine things about some like bits of philosophy about the senses and experience and how the logic works. I can go into instead details about the biology and the neurons and the way the neurons connect to the brain. I could even do something about spiritual philosophy. I could talk about how, because of the experiences that I am having, these experiences are at some kind of foundational ground level, but these are just different thought bubbles. The key is recognizing that without the thought, I still know. The thoughts can be wrong, but I still know. This is real. Everything else is not, of course, it's not unique to the hands, but if it doesn't relate to the hands, if it doesn't relate to the breath, the feeling of my feet on the ground, then it's almost certainly a thought bubble. And again, thought bubbles are not bad. It's just that there's a tendency, particularly in our culture, like the whole problem with culture is basically this, that there's a tendency to create thought bubbles and then live there as though that's reality, to intentionally lose the rooting of this back into the soil of the material. So one sign, so I can give signs and I can describe it to you and give you this theory, but the danger with that, I think this is where there's a lot of annoying paradoxicalness that keeps showing up in a lot of mystical teachings, is the attempt to deal with this paradox. Like Zen's answer to dealing with this paradox is to refuse to discuss anything that's in a thought bubble. And anytime anyone tries to bring a thought bubble forward, to break the structure of it by offering something, some sort of idea, some sort of response that cannot fit well within that bubble. The attempt is to bring it right back to the body, back to the body, back to the body. I think Zen would object to what I'm saying, because what I just did was describe this model. And then there's this icon of the body that you're anchoring things to. The key is to distinguish between that and that's not an intellectual distinction. You can create a copy of that distinction in a thought bubble. But the distinction is one you make by the choice of where you look. Are you experiencing your clothing? Are you experiencing your breath? Are you actively in touch with it? Or are they like background experiences that when you come back from your thoughts, you go, oh, right, I'm here. I just ate half my hamburger and I didn't notice, or whatever, right? People can go through entire meals with their tongue providing their brain with information about what the flavors are like, but without actually tasting the food. They might even remember, oh yeah, that tasted good, but it's almost like information that a computer presents, rather than something that is lived in the present moment. So some in terms of TAPS, trigger action patterns, that I think are useful along these lines, to notice, and it's a little tricky because the triggers are if something isn't happening. The lack of an experience is hard to make taps about. But if it were straightforward, this whole process would be really fast. It would be really easy. With that caveat, do you see what your eyes are pointed at? Okay. That's a big one for a lot of people. So oftentimes when we go to a thought bubble, we move our eyes away and then we are seeing the inside of the thought bubble. You think about things like existential risk from artificial intelligence. Are there going to be machines that become smarter than the entire human race, that wipe out the human race? How close are we to that? What are your models? What are your timelines? When a thought comes up, what are you seeing? And this is a sensory question. What do you see? What do you experience? Do you lose track of this screen when you start to answer those questions? again, it's not that that's bad. Sometimes it's useful to go off and do a computation. But the big challenge is that most of us, I think, have gotten, definitely true for me, and I think this is the epidemic. This is the real pandemic. This has been going on for millennia. That we have a culture of addiction to going into these thought bubbles and living there. So doing the opposite move of grounding back in this, really living here. I don't know the theory for how to do that. It seems to just be a simple choice. Right? So noticing, do you see where your eyes are pointing? Are you experiencing your breath? Okay. Okay. A big, I think maybe when you're not experiencing your breath, coming back to the breath is a pretty big one. This is a common meditation technique. There's a sign that you're going off into the weeds, which is when you're speeding up, but you haven't decided that you are going to enter a thought bubble. What I mean by speeding up is I've had a kind of pace, for instance, throughout this, because I've been concentrating a lot on anchoring, being here, being material, materializing, being incarnate. But I can easily, like if I set that aside, there's a way that I can sort of connect like the theories that I was talking about in terms of how memetics work and the flow of culture and how this interacts with like the evolution of meditation and meditation teachings, and what the mechanisms are in terms of like, well, so what is the body, and what is this process of using, like, what are you directing from these thought bubbles into the body, right? There's a kind of speed here that I can really get into, and it can feel engaging, and this is not inherently bad, but if I don't notice that I chose to do that, then the chances are very good that I am entering a thought bubble that I am confusing for reality. How ready am I to pause? If I have to fill the space, if there's an urgency, that's a sign that I'm out of touch. So those are some examples of pieces that I use that I think are pretty general, that might help with your question. I see you saying, should doesn't mean anything. First of all, oh, Val is saying something about meta-ethics. Then later on, oh, that's real, I experience it. Yes, yes. Exactly. There's a feeling, I feel like there's one sense in which I'm not saying anything new. This is not just there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, if you sort of smash together memetics with Buddhism, you could probably derive something like half or so of most of my points. Well, I don't know about a given person being able to derive it, but I'm under the impression that if you combine those two, you could get a large chunk of what I see for the world, and what I'm envisioning is necessary in terms of doing the kind of internal evolution that I think could actually do good things. I don't know about half, but oh man, that caught me by surprise. Okay. Yeah, this whole game of noticing that I can complete a thought and an analysis in a thought bubble. And I can even have in that thought bubble how important it is to get out of thought bubbles and into the material world. But that I know that's different from rooting it here. Really rooting it here. So I love that example. Thank you. That really tickles. Okay. I feel complete And it looks like I'm caught up on chats. So thank you for listening. This has felt really good to me. Part of the game here was that I wanted to really ground some things I'm struggling with. And there's some that I'm honestly struggling with. In particular, I imagine that soon I'm going to dive a lot more into my own experience of grappling with the fear of death. I've come to realize what grappling means a lot more deeply. A lot of my conversation with Carissa yesterday, and I mean conversation that wasn't recorded. Y'all didn't see that one. It was a follow-up that she and I did on the day that I didn't do a live stream. So a lot of that conversation felt like her pointing out that I had all these wonderful thought bubble models about how to do processing, and I had thought bubble reasons why it hadn't worked. But to suggest doing this move, and me noticing, oh, right. So I imagine I'll have more to say about that soon. So in the meantime, thank you.